Okay, so let's get going, looking at capitalism, right? And at the danger of sounding a little bit like overconfident, most people, I'm 57 years old. For most of my life, most people have said, oh, there's nothing we can do because of capitalism. And for a long time, I agreed. I went away and ran a farm for years thinking, yeah, fair enough. However, since 2008, I've been of the opinion, and a lot of other people have been of the opinion, still a minority view, that it's actually totally surmountable, this capitalism problem. All right, so if we look at the literature, first of all, on it's a massive problem, there's nothing that can be done. Let's just look at that for a minute. So there's really two literatures. There's the neoliberal literature itself. So I'm sure lots of people are familiar with this. You can see it on the news every night. A Tory MP comes in, or a Democrat, or all the political class. They'll come in and they'll say, "Look, it's great, free market. It's going to make everyone richer." And we've had this narrative for decades. It's a great stuff, and it's got a lot of logic to it. There's no question about that. And empirically, it looked pretty good, at least until 2008. So there's that. And then on the other side of the equation, there's been this thing which you might call capitalist realism, which this scholar from London, media scholar, I think, called Mark Fisher. I mentioned him in other episodes. And there's a sort of paradox here, because he's quite a radical guy, obviously. And he's saying, look, capitalist realism is saying capitalism is set, it's like, it's an act of nature. There's nothing you can do about it. This is the story being sold as this Tina thing. There is no alternative. And he's sort of half saying this is a lie. But the problem is that's become a self-fulfilling prophecy on the left. So what the left does, and again, I've talked about this quite a bit, particularly what I call left defeatism, is what the people on the left and progressives generally do is convince themselves of their own lack of agency. They're so clever by saying capitalism's this, and if you try and do any reforms, you'll get done in, and it's all powerful, and it's really terrible. And the unintended consequence of this, or maybe subliminally, the consequence of this is everyone goes, oh yeah, it's hopeless, isn't it? We can just retreat into critique and moaning and isolation and such like. So, yeah, both these literatures are no longer credible. Now, there's this thing called cultural lag, where, something that used to be credible and now is no longer credible is still seen to be credible because there's this lag effect. So people that control the media, people that control the left media, they're still sort of hooked into this thing which is no longer objectively true because times have moved on. And this because the logic of the neoliberal message is actually contradicted. So they say people are getting richer through neoliberalism, and they were, in which case it's a problem to argue with, but now it's self-evident they're not, life expectancy is going down, increase in poverty, all this sort of stuff. And so then they're saying, well, it's a bit of a blip, there's been COVID, blah, blah. But everyone sort of knows it's on the way down because that's history, right? Things get better and then they get worse. So what I'd like to introduce is this notion of replacing capitalist realism with revolutionary realism. So revolutionary realism is saying actually the opposite, right? Which is not that capitalism's indestructible, but capitalism is going to disappear of its own accord because of its contradictions, which is a sort of return to sort of early Marxist sort of reductive stuff where they were going, oh, capitalism's going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Marxists are in the march of history. History's behind us and we're going to take control of stuff, which, has its pros and cons. However, in the 2020s, what we can say and we've been saying this, particularly earlier in the episodes, is this is objective because physics is objective, and if you melt all the ice in the Arctic, you're going to destroy the world economy, and if you destroy the world economy, the world trading system is going to collapse, and you're going to have the inevitable collapse of capitalism and what have you. All right, so there's two scenarios of the destruction of capitalism. The first one is imposed externally from nature, as you might say, through the climate crisis. So there's two elements to it. There's the primary effects of the climate crisis, and then there's the secondary effects. So, for instance, the primary effect, these things are coming through every week nowadays. A primary effect is there's a drought in Panama, and they're going to get half the number of ships through the Panama Canal than they used to because of lack of water. So everything's going to have to go around South America. So that's a primary effect. A secondary effect is what's just been in the news this week, which is there's a war in the Middle East around Gaza, and shipping is being attacked in the Red Sea. So everything's having to go around South Africa. So in that situation, it's not directly related with the climate, but obviously as things increase, lack of water in the Middle East or whatever, wars and civil wars take place, and the secondary effect of climate is basically increasing the costs of engaging in international capitalism. This pushes up inflation, it's a real thing, and this creates the fiscal crisis of the state. Okay, so the other side, the other sort of crisis is within the system, which is within society, which is what I've been talking about for all these episodes, is how to proactively design that revolution. And as we've discussed, in actuality, it's going to be a combination of the two, right? There's going to be climate shocks. That's going to create secondary effects. That's going to enable the revolutionary vanguard, or whatever nice word you want to call it, to organise people around real living conditions that are deteriorating, and that's going to overcome the state within the context of it going through a major fiscal crisis, i.e. it's run out of money. I forgot to mention, two things that have come up in the last year, apart from Panama Canal, is the insurance crisis. So as the climate crisis becomes more severe, you can't get insurance in many parts of the world because of flooding or because of fires. It's happening in America. And then you've got the coastal property bubble all around the world. You've got all these very expensive properties on the coast, which used to be, a good idea. And you have to pay a lot of money for your property. And now, these properties are dead. Everyone knows they're dead, but no one's actually decided to, trigger that collapse of those prices. So there's a whole bunch of things, as we know, which are coming along the line. So the point here, supports this notion of revolutionary realism, not capitalist realism. Revolutionary realism is saying, in the actual realistic analysis of society, capitalism is now going to collapse, whether we like it or not. All right, so overcoming capitalism in some ways is a bit like within that old capitalist realism frame. It's like, there's capitalism, it's so powerful, how can we overcome it? And what I'm saying is, no, it's going to collapse, right? The major problem isn't capitalism, it's going to be fascism, i.e. what comes after capitalism. And in so much as we have this proactive revolution, the question really is, how do we construct a post-capitalist society in the meta context, as it were, of the climate crisis and the secondary effects? So the question is, what replaces capitalism? And this is always sort of asked as nothing can, so you can't do anything, which is avoiding the obvious answer, right? There's an obvious sociological and historical answer, which is what replaces capitalism is state control of the economy. It's as simple as that. Someone just needs to say it. State control of the economy. It has happened. It will happen again. State control of the economy has been a norm through thousands of years of history. States tell you what you can do and what you can't do, for better or worse. But no one can pretend that it's not a viable social design, right? It happens, there's ethical problems with it, there's political problems with it, but it has happened and there's no reason why it won't happen again. And obviously under that phrase, state control of the economy, is a whole, range of different levels of authoritarianism or participation. And obviously those are things that we need to talk about. Okay, so that's sort of like, overcome capitalism. What comes next? State control of the economy. What does that sort of mean? So the point here, as I say, is like it happens because there's a crisis. These two things go together. There's a climate crisis. The market economy, for better or worse, cannot organise society in an emergency. That's like a sociological golden rule. So, for instance, in World War II, some of you may know this example, the American government said, we're going to produce tanks rather than cars. All the car factories had to stop producing tanks. I think it was 1943. No cars were produced at all in the United States. If someone who owned the factory said, actually, I want to keep producing cars, then they were told they would go to prison. That's state control of the economy. That's a national emergency. It was in an existential war with the Japanese, with the Nazis. This is the deal, guys, right? Now, again, I'm not saying like that's necessarily good or bad, but it's an inevitable functional outcome of a crisis of a society that has a functioning state. It's the state takes things over. The obvious modern example is COVID. You had a right-wing government, neoliberal government, crisis hits. Oh, suddenly everyone's told they can't go to work. Oh, suddenly everyone's getting paid by the state because otherwise they're going to run out of money. In other words, the reason of the state, i.e. the role of the state to maintain essential functionality of a society trumps capitalism. This is a historical no-brainer. That's what happens. Now, there's major problems with this, as all the neoliberal scholars will say, right? But the fact that there's problems doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and it doesn't mean it has to be as bad as they're going to say. But there's no point pretending that it doesn't have major problems. There are major problems with socialism. You can read, Road to Serfdom by that guy. There's a bunch of books, and they're making a clear point. So what are these problems? The black market, right? If you fix prices, if you ration things, people take stuff and they'll sell them, behind the shop counter, going along the road, right? It's inevitable. There's a corruption of that. Secondly, there's authoritarianism. It's like you're going to produce tanks, otherwise you're going to prison. Like you do this, otherwise that will be the consequence. That's a problem, right? It's not in an ideal society, that wouldn't be the case. Again, there's different degrees of that, but it's an essential element, you could argue, of a socialistic system. You have to do various things. The third problem is lack of creativity, initiative, bad decision making, because someone at the top is making all the decisions. It's not as sophisticated as the market. People have to do what someone's told them to do. They can't create things. They can't show initiative. That undermines innovation. It undermines human well-being, lack of freedom. And the other point is that all these things, due to entropy principles, i.e. things tend to get worse, right, over time. So you might have a great socialist state, a great, state economy, everyone's into it. And then over time, the criticism that the neoliberals make becomes more and more empirically obvious. In the same way as the neoliberal system, has its pros and cons, and it starts off pretty well in many ways, raising living standards, freeing up the economy, and then it starts to degenerate. In other words, what we're trying to do here is instead of having an ideological, static, out of time and space orientation of, socialism's this, the market is this, we have a situated historical analysis where we say things tend to be good and then they degenerate, right? So it's not like something is good or bad in and of itself. So really the issue here is is how great the problem is. It's not like whether we're going to have it or not. We're going to have state control of the economy because that's determined by an existential crisis, whether it's a disease or a war or natural disaster, in inverted commas, i.e. climate crisis type stuff. In other words, like, yeah, it's situated in a situation. So the practical question from a design point of view is, how do you take state control of the economy and humanise it and make it more effective and lessen the black market stuff, lessen the authoritarian stuff, lessen the lack of creativity and such like. So let's look at a few things that have been done in the past and a few cards we've got in the future, as you might say. So I'm going to anchor this design in the 1970s. I'm going to be working a bit on this, on trying this idea I've got of building the new civilization. It's going to be anchored in a 1970s model, which, doesn't sound that exciting, not least because we've had 40 years of propaganda that, before 1989, nothing worked properly and the workers were in control and all this sort of stuff. And, there were valid criticisms. And at the same time, arguably, at least in the UK, the 1970s was when people were happiest, or that's when happiness reached its peak. Secondly, that's when there was peak equality, and big social welfare systems and all the rest of it. So it definitely had its plus points, even though no one's saying it was perfect. But what's interesting about that is there's a high degree of state intervention into the economy, and it had its downsides, but there were some plus points, and we can add elements on in the 2020s, 2030s, in other words, new innovations. So let's, broadly have a look at the sort of issues that would need to be looked at. Okay, so I'm going to split this into sort of top-down design, right, and bottom-up design. So straight away, I'm making a big sort of analytical move here is state socialism does not mean or need not mean purely top-down. It could, and it certainly has historically, but it doesn't need to. It can have top-down elements and also bottom-up elements. I'm going to run through them. So potentially the most exciting and necessary element of a top-down state control stroke socialist system is planning, right? This is the alternative, the pragmatic alternative to the free market. And this necessitates simplification. So a lot of people who are high on the whole neoliberal thing are going, oh, you can't have planning, it will just destroy everything and it's too complicated and complex. So there's two responses to that. Number one is simplification. You do not need, 100 different varieties of toothpaste, right? It's not functional. It doesn't add anything to social welfare. You can have 5 sorts of toothpaste. You can produce them in the factories. You can work out which ones are more popular and you can produce more of them. Okay, to use a simple example. In other words, and there's a thing on YouTube called, The Great Simplification. There's lots of people saying this is this surge of fossil fuel, profligacy, or whatever the right word is going to come to an end. That doesn't mean everything's going to collapse in a heap and we're all going back to caves. What it means is things that go up tend to come down. And they might come down to the 1970s where there isn't that much going on. But there are things going on, and that enables planning to happen. So that's like a simplification response. The other response is using computer technology. And lots of people have talked about this, digital stuff. In Chile in 1973, 74, they started doing this. They get loads of data in around the economy, and then the planning is a lot more smart than in the old days where you're just getting a report once a week from some, tractor factory in the Soviet Union or whatever. So you've got a more real-time process, and you can go and check it out. It's really interesting stuff. Okay, and then you've got the notion of citizens' assembly. You can have a citizens' assembly running the state, right? So instead of having this, tendency towards authoritarianism, you've got a legitimation process whereby that citizen assembly says, yeah, actually, we've heard all the facts and we do need to nationalise the railways, and then it gives greater legitimation rather than some left-wing government going, we're doing this because it's our ideology, so stuff you. And I've mentioned that, I talked about that in some of the recent episodes. All right, then you have like this national top-down research into how to enable a humane form of migration, in so much as hundreds of millions of people are going to be migrating. That's going to be the big like challenge of the 21st century. And the second thing, big challenge, is geoengineering. In other words, like what the state does is take controls of these massive challenges and puts research into them and bureaucratic power and money and all the rest of it, and actually says we're going to have a systematic approach for people that need to migrate to the global north. We're going to have a systematic approach to organising what we need to do over the Arctic to stop it from melting. And no one's pretending it's some sort of ideal utopian solution, but it's better than chaos, and it's more humane than having a fascistic orientation, for instance. Next thing is less imports. This is part of the simplification agenda, right? Which is before 1989, for the previous 10,000 years, things happened and you didn't have to have 90% of your manufactured goods coming on ships from China or whatever it is, right? It's a recent phenomenon. It started and it will finish, and it can finish and it will finish, right? That doesn't mean there's no imports. It means we go back to that steady state scenario where, 10% of the things that people eat or consume are imported. People still want oranges, that's fine, but they're not going to get 100 sort of like kiddies trucks from China every year, right? That's just not necessary. It's not particularly interesting from a human happiness point of view. So again, simplification. Rationing of luxuries. Rationing of luxuries is no, you're not, it's different from saying, oh, you can have a luxury if you want to pay for it. Why should that happen? Why shouldn't it be distributed more egalitarianly? People want some luxuries. If they want them, then they get some sort of ration around it. Free basics. Like this is the big, attractiveness of socialism in the 20th century, obviously, is socialisation of food production, housing, health, National Health Service. Massively popular, massively effective in terms of what it provided for people, yet limited choices, certain amount of authoritarianism, certainly a load of bureaucracy, and at the same time, it was more functional than a free market system, as you've seen, probably aware of the mess with medicine in the United States. All right, so those are like the top-down things, right? And all of them can be messed about with and run well and get legitimised through these bottom-up mechanisms I'm going to come on to next. So small businesses are okay. In other words, like state control of the economy does not mean the market disappears, right? What it means is if you're running a small business or you work for yourself, you're a plumber, cool, no problem, right? You're not exploiting the economy. You're not some big international corporation. When I was 18, 19, I read collectives in the Spanish Revolution, 1936, 1937. A lot of things were collectivized, but if some guy didn't employ people and he wanted to run his own patch of land, then that was fine, right? Let him do it. In other words, there's a certain humanity and common sense element at a local level saying, yeah, there can be diversity, there can still be markets and all this stuff. But the big elements of the economy, which are essential to control, to make sure that they're actually doing what we need to produce our basic goods, they're controlled by the government. Workers' participation in production. People have been talking about this, for at least 200 years. I'm not going to talk about it much here, but this is the idea of bottom-up sociability, right? Some of the workers sit on the board of the company or the nationalised industry. So instead of getting a top-down bureaucracy telling people what to do, you've got this mediating factor of having, workers from the shop floor or people that are involved in that area of work participating in it and looking after their interests and, dare I say it, coming up with solutions to things which are a lot more grounded. Assemblies for decision-making, rotating boards and what have you. So we've talked about this loads, obviously, but having a political system whereby there's assemblies, they're going to, through sortition, through chance, select people for national assemblies, and that's going to democratise and legitimise the state control elements and hopefully make them more efficient because they're getting feedback rather than just being isolated, top-down, left-wing governments. So then there's cultural elements like having a culture within social movements of service, of duty, of coming together. And this is a massive oiling of the wheels. You saw it in World War II. So this isn't going to come out of anywhere. It's something that needs to be produced through cultural content producers, through social movements and such like. In other words, this is a living thing. It's not like some authoritarian takeover by left-wing governments and all this stuff. And then you've got the culture of making do. Again, I've talked about that before, but having this big paradigm shift where people are going, yeah, I don't actually need all this stuff. It's destroying the world for my kids anyway. I'm happy to come to some sort of national legislation on what we need and what we don't need. People can fly once a year. People need to recycle stuff. We don't have built-in obsolescence. All this stuff that's desperately waiting to happen. It's common sense. Okay, so, that's not it's just, the point of this episode isn't to give you, a 5-hour summary about the best designs, but that's something for you watching this video, and obviously for the broader movements around the world to start filling in the gaps, right? To get 100-page documents on how you're going to have decision-making in industry. And this is the project, right? All these elements need to come together and they need to be put forward. And so you can say to people, number one, capitalism's crap. It's crap. It's fucking everyone over. And number two, it's going to collapse anyway. And what we need to do is design this future revolution and what's going to happen after capitalism. And here's a 100-page document on the practicalities of it in the UK over the next 20 years, for instance. It's not going to be utopia, but you've got these new cards to play, right? Computer technology, the social technologies of humanized assemblies and such like. All right. So just as a little aside, if any of you are interested in this, there's a book called, I read 20 years ago, Build the Road as We Travel. It's about Mondragon. Mondragon's, again, got lots of problems. It's a real world scenario, but it happens to be the biggest complex of cooperatives in the Western world, over the last 50 years. Well worth reading at least the first few chapters of it. So you get a sense of what this new social arrangement can be, in between the free market capitalism people and the, traditional bottom, top-down Marxist people. All right, so I would suggest the challenge here is not the design itself, right? What we're trying to look at in these add-ons is this general phenomenon of degeneration in social systems and entropy in social systems. So the problem here is, we can set up this great stuff, but how do we stop it from degenerating? And then you have to go through all this cycle again and, have the potential of having even greater climate crises or existential crises because things get out of hand. This is a big, big problem, and I'm going to look at it in the next, add-on episodes. But what can be said is what we have to be aware of is capitalism is not a foundational problem. It's a substantive problem, and don't, misread me here. Capitalism has to go. Capitalism means human extinction without a question of a doubt, right? Trying to cut costs and externalise has reached the end of the road. You're externalising your costs to the extent that you're destroying the ability to create production. Full stop, right? That does not mean that what comes after capitalism won't create the same problems, right? There's a history before capitalism, before 1500, for the sake of argument, of plunder, of patriarchal, obscenities, all the rest of it going back, you can argue, 10,000 years. So what's going to come after capitalism could well produce another ruling class. It could be a socialist ruling class, what you sort of got in the Soviet Union. So it's not a binary. It's not like capitalism, get rid of it, everything's going to be fine. So we need to look at that, and we need to see how can we stop a new ruling class emerging, or mitigate that, or produce mechanisms to stop this degeneration into a sort of internal degeneracy, return to hierarchy, unaccountable elites, and then an external degeneracy where you're going back and plundering nature or plundering people who are less powerful than yourselves. It's a big question, and we'll look at it over the next 2 or 3 episodes. Thanks.